Welcome to the second of two videos. We're spending some time reviewing changes in special education procedures that came out in the August 2016 release. In the first video, we spent most of our time reviewing some changes in the child find area, particularly in the language and wording of the disability suspect form. We're going to continue with a few other miscellaneous items and changes that we see in this new release. I'm going to start out with one final item that is also related to child find, but it has to do with the potential use of outside reports that we might use in suspecting disability. What you're seeing on screen right now are kind of a comparison of old language and new language. So up here in 2015, you can see that within the large procedures document, there is a listing of things that a team may consider, and the key word there was may. The following data sources in considering a suspicion of disability. Among that list, we found reports from outside providers. So that could, for example, could be a report from a psychiatrist, some other types of developmental evaluations that were done in a medical community, or other types of outside organizations. So in 2015, the word may was used, but you can see here in the 2016 language, it says the team shall consider all relevant available information, which may include, and there's a list of possible data sources, but notice the report from outside providers is listed there. So bottom line, the change is the language is changed to may. Instead of may, we have shall. So that is something that teams should consider when looking at suspecting a disability. That doesn't mean that an outside provider report will completely direct the decision, but it should be considered. Because if you look here at the rationale, again, this is coming from the eligibility and evaluation standards. And you can see that quote there: the public agency shall review the outside provider's report to see if it creates, standing alone or with other evidence, a suspicion that the child might need special education because of disability. So we will sometimes have reports from outside providers, may indicate things like ADHD or other categorical kinds of disabilities. We are obligated to consider those in terms of suspecting an educational disability. And again, I would reiterate, considering that information doesn't mean that it will direct the final decision. Sometimes we will see outside reports that will be very directive and say things such as this child should have an IEP. Considering the information might lead us to suspect a disability and to conduct a full and individual evaluation, but we would still follow the eligibility guidelines in our Iowa process. Our next topic deals with open enrollment approval or denial in cases where a student has a disability and an IEP. And if you take a look at what's on screen here, this information is reminding us that this part is not new. When a district receives an open enrollment request from a student who has a disability and IEP, there is the possibility that they could deny that. You can see down here in this language that was already in the procedures, a potential receiving district could deny an open enrollment application for a couple of reasons. One, if it does not have space, or, and this is kind of the one that we're going to examine here, if they cannot provide an appropriate program. So if a receiving district reviewed information on a student with a disability and they could not provide appropriate programming, they could not provide FAPE, they could deny that, and in those cases they'd provide prior written notice to the family regarding this denial, if it's in regards to inability to provide an appropriate special education program. So this language was already in the procedures, but we can see some changes here. Let's take a look at this top paragraph. So when an open enrollment application is made, the potential receiving district considers whether it has adequate classroom space, and for eligible individuals who require district-provided specially designed instruction, determines whether it can provide a free appropriate public education for the child. This determination must be made in consultation with the resident district and the appropriate area education agencies before approval of the application. So you can see this new language, and there is Iowa code that is being cited there that kind of guided this change. There essentially needs to be a consultative meeting to discuss this issue. So a student has an IEP, they apply for open enrollment, following all the normal timelines and rules. There needs to be a consultation involving the resident district and the AEA. So this is a change from past practices. I would note that a number of years ago, when the first two virtual schools were established in Iowa, there were some specific procedures put together, and it did specify that there needed to be this consultative type of a meeting involving the AA and resident district, and that has been going on the last several years. But you can see now this is being deemed appropriate for all students. If they apply for open enrollment and they have a disability, there should be discussion of whether or not the receiving district can provide that program. So receiving district and AA would connect, involve the sending district, the resident district, and those folks would have a consultative meeting to make this decision. Notice here it says the AA Director of Special Education will designate those professionals who will participate. In Green Hills AEA, typically the designees would be a regional administrator serving that district and or a special education representative. Those folks would be the AA connection for this meeting. As we scroll down here, you can see some other language that gives us some guidance on what if there's a conflict or some disagreement. And it says if the appropriateness of the special education program in the receiving district is at issue, a final determination of the appropriateness would be the responsibility of the AA Director of Special Education, in which the receiving district is located. So a director from the AA may get involved if there's question about this, and so that could be part of the problem-solving process as well. At our fall special education coordinators meeting, we will be reviewing this change with district coordinators, and so they will be informed that when we do have these cases, when a student with an IEP applies for open enrollment, this type of process needs to be set up, and involving the AA, receiving district, and resident district. This next section is actually on page 11 of your release notes, and you can see the category is identifying special considerations. So you can see this bulleted list. These are the items that are familiar to us on page B, where IEP teams will check areas that are of concern for a student. And if you look at the language, again, the yellow is modified language in the procedures guide. You can see what's being talked about here. This is essentially just a clarifying paragraph or two. And what it's telling us here is that, well, for one thing, AIM, or accessible instructional materials, is added specifically because we know that's a consideration. Sometimes that's Braille or other ways for students accessing text. But you can see what's being said there. It's just an acknowledgement that when an IEP team is going through this planning process, these variables are not mutually exclusive. There's relationships between them. For example, there's a relationship between Braille and AIM. There's a relationship between AIM and AT. There's certainly a relationship between AT and communication concerns. So essentially the language here is just encouraging IEP teams to really carefully consider all these areas and do their best to develop an authentic, holistic plan that takes these relationships into consideration. There's also some additional language in the area of assistive technology, and you can kind of see the paragraph that's highlighted in yellow in front of you here. Just some clarifying language reminding us that assistive tech tools are those that support learner engagement. They allow the student to do something he or she could not do without the technology. And it also reminds us that the assistive tech supports and devices can really be, there's a whole continuum of them. They can be simple no-cost tools or adaptations. They give examples like an easel that brings a book or paper into position for accessibility. It can be an adaptation to technology already available, changing the keyboard settings on perhaps a computer or laptop the student may already have, or it can be high-tech equipment with dynamic voice output. So that paragraph is just simply reminding us of the wide range of possibilities of things that can be assistive technology that would allow students with disabilities to engage better and to do some things they couldn't do otherwise. As we move on in the assistive tech notes here, this next little section of new language just reminds us that the IEP team does have a responsibility to decide if a student requires assistive technology. And it does mention something that can be a common practice, particularly for higher tech devices. The decision can be made through selection of appropriate AT devices and trial use in authentic environments, and then collecting data to see if that's an appropriate device. So sometimes there are trial devices. Data-based decision making is done through collection of data, and if that AT is required, then that information makes its way into the IEP. Moving on to page 12, there's some additional language on AIM, or accessible instructional materials, and I think this is actually very helpful. There's some guiding questions that IEP teams could use to probably make better decisions about whether or not AIM is required for a student. So let's just take a look at those. Again, these are just added as a set of questions or tools that IEP teams could use to more effectively answer that question. Does the student require AIM? First one, can the student visually see the material well enough to read it? Some students have visual difficulties, and Braille or magnification is necessary, and that's, of course, a form of AIM. Next one, can the student physically manipulate the material without excessive effort? Could be a consideration for some of our students that have physical disabilities, where they would have difficulty lifting books or could not lift books or turn pages. The next one, does the student have the needed stamina to read for extended periods of time? Is a consideration. And can the student decode words at or near grade level? Some students with very significant reading disabilities and delays in that area may need AIM as well. So we have students who need and require things like Bookshare or text-to-speech kinds of tools that help them access the text they need to in the classroom. And then also some new text here. It mentions when we consider a student's need for AIM, there tend to be 4 general types of conclusions that can be reached. Number 1, student can use standard print-based instructional materials used across a curriculum by other students and does not require specialized formats. Number 2, the student requires exactly the same content but in specialized formats. So that could look a variety of ways. It could be the exact same textbook in Braille or magnified or in a text-to-speech format through a tool like Bookshare or Kurzweil. Number 3, the student requires modified content or alternative materials and does not require specialized formats. Some students have that need. And number 4, the student requires modified content or alternate materials in specialized formats. So this language is just pointing out that if we carefully consider students' needs, these are the kinds of conclusions we will typically come to, one of these 4 conclusions. Now, as we're talking about AIM, there's also some additional language that's really sort of a reminder in the documentation guide. So the part of our procedures that kind of gives us a page by page and reminds us what goes where. This is a reminder of how we would document typically AT considerations and things like AIM. Let's just kind of walk through this. So if a team identifies the option for a student that requires specialized formats, then the team would mark yes for AIM on the present levels. So that would be checked yes, and provide language summarizing that decision-making process, which we kind of just talked about. Thinking through those questions, how do we come to the conclusion that they need that? That should be summarized in the other information essential for the development of the IEP, that text box on on tab B. So it should be summarized there. Then the AT consideration checkbox will generally be checked along with an AT device if needed, or AT support. So these, when appropriate, these things on tab F would be open up as boxes and described. Accessible instructional materials must be selected in the pull-down tab on page F, activities, and that will create a text box, and information related to AIM could be listed there. So you would list materials and media that support the need for AIM. We would include information related to the required AIM in the activities. Also, it points out here that we would want to consider participation in non-academic or extracurricular activities as well. If there's needs there, we would want to address that also. And of course, if the team identifies a student does not require specialized formats, it's a simple no on that AIM checkbox, and there would be no additional documentation. Next, there are some additions to the accommodations section in the documentation guide. And again, we're just looking at our yellow highlights here that are some additional language and points added. So in general, just a comment here for clarification purposes, accommodations may not change what's being assessed and must follow the directions of the specific assessment tool regarding allowable accommodations. So kind of a caution there that accommodations shouldn't really change the construct of what is being assessed. If we go down here too, there's also a note for students that are ELL, that are English language learners, that also have significant cognitive disabilities. And that has been clarified by the Department of Education, and it's noted in the procedures here. So ELL students that have significant cognitive disabilities, intellectual disabilities, they are required by law to participate in the ALPA 21 assessment. Now the IEP team would have may exempt the reading domain if it's not accessible to the student. If any of the accessibility features of the ALPA 21 assessment are required for the student to access and participate in the assessment, then these accessibility features must be documented as accommodations. So again, this is focusing on the fact that if we have an ELL student that also is intellectually disabled, then we would, and we're using accessibility features, we need to document that in the IEP. And it just mentions finally that third bullet, the IEP team with the participation or input from the ELL teacher determines testing accommodations. So just a reminder that for students that are ELL that also have intellectual disabilities, there is still the requirement for the ALPA 21, and it's reminding the IEP teams that they need to consider accommodations for this as well. Page 14 of the release notes address this idea of move-in IEP. Now this is looking specifically as a meeting type, and you can see kind of in our visual here in Web IEP, the drop-down menu where we select a type of meeting, keeping in mind when kids do move in, perhaps from out of state, when we pull them into the system, we have an indication of that. But what we're talking about is when we're opening up an IEP, we have to indicate a meeting type. And there is one category called move-in, and the notes here that have just been added to in the procedures guide are really clarifying. Text has been added to describe that this is really designed to be used in limited circumstances. So the move-in IEP as a type of meeting is really only to be used, and it's stated very explicitly here, for out-of-state move-ins in close proximity to the count date, to the special education count date in October, that allows entry into the count data so that they can be counted and financial considerations can be taken into account during the count. So if we have an eligible individual that moves in shortly before count date, we have the option of using this move-in IEP as a meeting type, and that's really the only time that we would use this. Otherwise, we'd have options of if it's just not close to count time, there could be an interim IEP if there was a need to collect more information, or it could be done as a review IEP. Some different options there, but the point here is that really this meeting type is only to be used as an option when there's a time frame that's very close to the count date. And a move-in IEP requires only, and this is the reason why it's used on a limited basis, you can see in the yellow down here, only limited parts are completed. Family tab, which has our student information or our adult information, page A, page F, describing basic services, and tab G if we're looking at transportation, and the RSD or the data tab. So if you think about those pages, that gives just essential information, enough data that would allow a student to get into the IMS system and be counted on the weighted enrollment for special education count time. And notice here it says that when we do that, we're still going to do a complete Iowa IEP as soon as practical. So if someone moves in on October 15th, just very shortly before count date, we might do a move-in IEP to give the data in the system what is needed to count that student, but then as soon as we can, we would be writing a full IEP as well. So essentially this is just a reminder that we only use this meeting type in that limited circumstance. Finally, I just wanted to point your attention to, this is page 2 of the release notes. We're jumping back a little bit here, but these are just simply under the category of miscellaneous edits. I won't read all these to you, but encourage you to take a look at these. They're just very small things where there's been a edit or a very small language change in the procedures guide. And some of these are just terminologies. For example, GED is changed to high school equivalency diploma. Some changes in language in regards to, for example, the AA resolution facilitator process replaced with direct negotiation among the persons with a disagreement with AA facilitation, and that was to avoid confusion with a resolution meeting. You can see there's an outdated term, what we used to call a pre-appeal conference, would now be called a mediation conference. So some updates in language and a few old terms in some cases were found and corrected in the manual. So those are listed in here just for your reference. There's some updated directions for registering for and accessing Transact. That's your source for getting form translations in different languages. That's updated as that website has evolved over the years and is slightly different in the way it's accessed. Another example, implementing the IEP on the web is replaced with validating the IEP, just a term that's a little bit more current to what we've been using. And down here, just slightly different names for the alternate assessments that we have in place in Iowa now. So just encourage you to take a quick look at page 2 for some of those changes. They are fairly minor, but wanted you to be aware of those. So as we end, I just want to remind you again where you can locate this information. Many of you did access this through a blog entry, and those things are linked there, but a reminder that the most current statewide procedures are always located on this site that you're seeing right here, www.iowaidainfo.org. That's your URL, and you can see here kind of this top story is the changes and procedures, the new manual here. Again, I want to encourage you to download the most current procedures guide, a very large document. In most cases, you'll probably want to download an electronic copy, very searchable, and also avoids a lot of paper that will slightly change every 6 months. A reminder that your release notes, 15-page summary of what is new and different, and then as well as some other documents are listed here. These are not new things, but they're listed here for easy access. I should mention too that the parental rights summary has not changed. Some people have asked that question. So the July 2015 version is still current. That's what we will use in distributing parental rights at IEP meetings. There are translations available for that, as well as some of the IEP forms translated live right here as well. So while those are archived in Transact as well, Some of the translated forms are also linked here for easy access in Iowa IDA info as well. So I wanted to point that out. Thanks again for listening to this presentation, and we'll end here. Thank you.